Donald Trump is now making an official post. Our deal with China is done, and the trade deal is now in place. Now we finally have the opportunity here to bring more security back into the markets. This is very, very bullish in the long term. But we can see that the market still doesn't quite trust it. That's why we're not seeing any massive price breakouts right now. But we're taking a very close look at what's included in this super sensitive situation. We also have new, highly sensitive inflation data, which turned out better than originally expected, but overall is still negative. The chances for interest rate cuts aren't necessarily increasing here, but Donald Trump is once again making hints. He wants to lower interest rates by a full percentage point. Even Shady Vance is now putting pressure on Jerome Powell. It's absolutely crazy what's going on here. They want to pump the markets, and Bitcoin all the way to Valhalla. Ukraine has now submitted a draft for a strategic Bitcoin reserve law. How wild is that? And now we have the first major Bitcoin treasury company in Germany, which apparently is buying Bitcoin. Be sure to leave me a like down below so Bitcoin can really take off here. We need to clearly break through the $110,000 mark, then reach new all-time highs, and then we can head toward Valhalla, but only if we get enough likes here. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to hit the subscribe button below. David Bailey also says the journey has only just begun. Focus on this strategy, and remember, when in doubt, the profits go to the believers, the people who stick with Bitcoin. That means, don't let yourself get shaken out, and in the long run, the people who believe in their strategy, who stay committed, and who don't let uncertainty shake them out, will be the ones who benefit. Even though we are at an all-time high, there's still a lot of doubt, and a lot of people are still unsure and so on. But do your own research, try to find out what Bitcoin actually offers. Try to understand its features, and then it will become clear to you that, in the long run, there's really only one direction this is going. And now let's take a look at what Donald Trump is saying, what's going on with the Fed, with China, the trade situation, and so on. But first, we see here that apparently there's now the first major Bitcoin treasury strategy in Germany. Here's a report. Everts Pharma is the first company in Germany to buy Bitcoin for its balance sheet, so that's not accurate at all. There are definitely other companies, like Terrash and so on, that already have Bitcoin on their balance sheets. But these are probably the first larger, more significant purchases. They want to buy 100 Bitcoin here, or actually, they've already done it. And you can see, they have nothing to do with Bitcoin directly. It's just a regular pharmaceutical company. Really crazy. I don't think so. I believe Sandler Scientific is also a pharmaceutical company, but I'm not entirely sure. But it's amazing how companies that originally had nothing to do with Bitcoin are now getting into Bitcoin. But now, let's take a look at the inflation data before we get to Trump and Xi Jinping. We can see here that the consumer price index inflation rose to 2.4% in May, which is below the expected 2.5%. So that's actually pretty good. Core consumer price inflation was at 2.8%, also below the expected 2.9%. So that's good as well. And for the first time since 2025, the overall consumer price index inflation is rising. That's basically the crux of the matter here. Even though it's actually better than expected, overall inflation is still rising. And of course, if overall inflation is rising, that puts pressure on the Fed not to lower interest rates. So it's exactly the opposite of what Donald Trump wants. The likelihood of an interest rate cut happening next week is basically zero, you could say. You can also see it here in comparison, if you take a closer look. I mean, right now we have consumer price inflation at about 2.4%, but for many healthcare needs, it's much higher. Inflation for utility gas is at 15.3%, car insurance at 7%, meat and eggs at 6.1%, auto repairs at 5.1%, electricity inflation at 4.5%, homeownership inflation at 4.2%, rent inflation at 3.8%, nursing care and out-of-home care at 3.8%, and healthcare sector inflation at 3.6%. And here is the assessment from Co-Base Letter. Even though the overall inflation rate has gone down, prices for many everyday goods are still rising rapidly. Americans are experiencing this inflation rate, and it's not just in America, it's the same in Germany, in Europe, and so on. And it's important here as well. Even if, let's say, the inflation data turns out better, it still means that everything keeps getting more expensive. That means, even if the inflation rates are going down, prices are still rising. They just might not be rising as sharply anymore. And in my opinion, Donald Trump is misinterpreting this here. He says here, CPI just came out, meaning the inflation data has been released. Very, very good numbers. The Fed should now cut, not inflation, but interest rates by a whole point, would pay much less interest on debt coming due. So important. So, we would now have to refinance much less debt, or the interest burden would simply be much, much lower. He has said this statement so many times already, but here he's saying that the inflation data is good. Yes, they are better than expected, but that by no means means that the inflation data is actually good. And now we even see JD Vance getting involved here, saying that the Fed's refusal to lower interest rates should be considered a monetary policy misstep. So he's viewing what's happening right now very, very critically. And it also looks like Donald Trump is trying to create awareness here. Hey folks, inflation needs to come down. If not, then we have a problem. Inflation needs to come down. If not, then we have a problem. He's even called for a 2% rate cut in an interview before, and those are pretty drastic demands. There's a really big gap here between Jerome Powell, who says, no, we're not going to cut rates, and Donald Trump, who's calling for a 1 to 2% rate cut, which would basically be the biggest rate cuts ever by the Fed, at least anything over 1% in one go. And now let's really take a look at the trade deal, which is of course extremely critical, and probably the single most important thing right now. And now it's finally finished. RDA, deal with China is done. So the deal with China is now complete. And Donald Trump is making a post about it on Truth Social. And we'll take a look at what you're saying exactly. He says, all required rare earths will be delivered in advance by China. We will also provide China with what was agreed upon, including allowing Chinese students to attend our colleges and universities, which I have always thought was a good thing. We will receive a total of 55% in tariffs, while China gets 10%. The relationship is excellent. Thank you very much for your attention. So it sounds like they've managed to strike a pretty good deal here, like they're not at odds anymore, and are actually coming together. Here he also says, adding to the China ride out, President Xi and I are going to work closely together to open up China to American traders. We want to open up China to American trade. The whole thing is supposed to be very, very good and is a win for both sides. So here we have Donald Trump, and that actually sounds pretty good. You also rarely hear much from Xi Jinping. Most of the time, it's just his representatives. I basically never hear anything from him. Donald Trump, on the other hand, always chimes in right away. To put it simply, the US collects 55% tariffs, China gets 10% tariffs, and the relationship is smooth, basically excellent. Yeah, but once again, with this deal, it says that final approval is still needed. But from the way it sounds to me, this is pretty much a done deal now. But I already made another video where I said exactly the same thing. Back then, we also had the preliminary thing and the final approval was still missing. But at that point, we just didn't have any details yet. Now we finally have all the details. And for China, of course, the tariffs on exports to the US are extremely high at 55%. You have to be very clear about that. It's also not like it dropped much lower than expected. If that had happened, the market probably would have gone up. It was probably just as the market had already priced in or expected. And for the US, the tariffs on exports here are, of course, rather low at 10%. That means the trade advantage for the US is now naturally increased, because the balance is simply being adjusted here. This means the burden for China is higher than for the US. So, we potentially have a trade advantage for the US here, which is supposed to balance out these imbalances. Donald Trump always talks about the trade deficit, but at the same time, he's giving China a bit of a carrot. Students are allowed to go to the US again, and raw material deliveries from China continue. So, we still have America first here, but it's a more pragmatic deal with China, where the US gets more. But China still keeps access to the US education system and export market. And yeah, I think at some point you just have to come to terms with that, you know? There probably won't be much room left for negotiation here. What I also found interesting here was US Treasury Secretary Vance saying, China should not be allowed to regain prosperity through exports. I thought that was a really strange statement too. I mean, that's always the thing, that sometimes you have these zero-sum games. That means one side thinks their gain depends on the other side's loss. Instead of letting the whole pie grow so that everyone benefits, you basically cut a piece off from someone else, take it for yourself, and then think, okay, we have to compete against each other. But the idea of a free market, of capitalism, is that the whole system grows, just like maybe with Bitcoin. If the entire pie simply gets bigger, then there's more pie left for everyone to eat. And if we just think in a limited way with a socialist mindset and think, okay, we have a limited pie and if someone cuts off a piece, then they're stealing it from someone else. I think that's always partly the wrong approach here. Yeah, you can write down below what you think about that. Anyway, I think now we still have the story about Ukraine here. I'll have to check where we got that from. Here in Ukraine, a draft law has been introduced that would allow the central bank to include cryptocurrencies, like Bitcoin, in its reserves. It also says here, the official Ukrainian parliament bought the last published bill, and then there's a number here. So now there is the official bill. There's also a statement here. We can take a quick look at that. We, the members of parliament, believe that this step to integrate Ukraine into the global financial markets could be very, very innovative, and that's why it follows the trend. Proper management of crypto reserves can help stabilize the macroeconomic environment and create new opportunities for the digital economy. says MP Yaroslav Zelensky. Zelensky. Drop a like below for me pronouncing that so well. And yeah, this is definitely a good step here. Like I said, it's not finalized yet. Ukraine is actually one of the top holders of Bitcoin, at least according to official statistics. Roughly, I think I checked earlier, 46,000 Bitcoin. But earlier, I also found another report, Let's take a quick look at that too. Here, for example, it says debunked. Ukraine didn't actually have 46,000 Bitcoin. They own fewer Bitcoin here, or maybe none at all. There are also recurring reports, for example, that China owns much less Bitcoin, or even the USA. There were even statements from the US itself, from their own side, saying that maybe the marshals did something with the Bitcoin, that they somehow lost track of it. Yeah, the management here didn't handle things well, and supposedly something happened with the Bitcoin. Up to now, there still hasn't been a real audit of the Bitcoin holdings in the US, which a lot of people are still waiting for. Then, of course, just like every day, we have other companies today that are buying large amounts of Bitcoin. Now we have the public company Remix Points, which has bought another 50 Bitcoin. So now they're holding almost 1,000 Bitcoin, and so on. So I think the momentum is definitely on Bitcoin's side right now. Of course, there are still a few uncertainties here because of the trading deals in the markets. If these uncertainties are also resolved, then there shouldn't be anything standing in the way of massive price rallies. At least that's my assessment here. Feel free to share your current assessment down in the comments. And if you don't have a place yet where you can easily buy Bitcoin, then I definitely recommend you check out 21 Bitcoin. It's the easiest way to buy Bitcoin here in Europe. With the code Bitcoin Hotel, you can still get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin. Absolutely recommended. If Bitcoin really takes off now, of course you want to be properly set up. But of course, yeah, also, guys, I wish you all the best. See you soon. Until then, peace out.